Hi, Dorene here at Fusion Pilates, and Christine's going to work on some hip extension here. So in your classes, a lot of times we talk about hip flexion versus hip extension, and I know some people don't know the difference, but we all just look at each other and go, what was she talking about? So Christine's right leg is actually in hip flexion. So when the angle in the front is at a 90, she's in hip extension. It doesn't have to be in a 90, but we'll call it that for now. And her left leg, so hip flexion, hip extension. Her left leg is in hip neutral. She's not really in hip extension. So here we're going to show you how to get a little hip extension, because most of us don't have enough hip extension, and we need hip extension to do basic things like walk. If I ask Christine to go into what it normally is considered a hip extension stretch, she probably takes her pelvis and moves forward, bending into the right leg a lot more. But notice that nothing really changed from when she was up here to when she's down here, right? The angle between, you can move that right foot forward if you need to, Chris. The angle between her femur and her pelvis hasn't changed. So come on back for me. What we really want to do is change the angle of what's going on between the leg and the pelvis, so that all of the muscles in here, which are your hip flexor muscles, there are 9, I believe. So if somebody says my hip flexor, you probably want to try and figure out which one they're talking about. I'd like her now to change the difference of what's going on between her femur bone and her pelvis. So I'm going to ask Christine to think about where her pubic bones are. So remember, your pubic bones are down here, and I'm not going to touch hers, but you want to keep the pelvis in line and try and move the pubic bones forward until you feel something happening between the hip and the pelvis. Do you feel that? So notice how she didn't have to go very far. She did change what's happening between the leg and the pelvis so that everything here is coming into hip extension. We spend most of our life in hip flexion. Think of sitting, driving, being on the sofa. You're generally in hip flexion instead of hip extension. And most of us, you start to feel like when you get up out of a chair, there's that, oh, I can't straighten my leg right away. It's because these guys are spending way too much time in flexion versus extension. Now, Christine's been working on this in one particular method. If I have her come back, and if I take this leg and move this leg in, so I've moved her lower leg in, and has now taken her upper leg and moved it into external rotation. So she can go ahead and do that same stretch, trying to hit the fibers a little bit differently than when she was in that neutral place. And does that feel any different for you? Right? Because most of us have, whether we know it or not, our femurs are slightly internally rotated as opposed to externally rotated. And here starts to work on having a little bit more stretch. Now you can take that, and it's called a rainbow load, and move that whole lower leg, come on back for me, and you can move it into a totally different place. So now her upper leg is in internal rotation, and as she goes forward, pubic bones leading, she's now working on the fibers with an internally rotated thigh. So there's your hip extension with a rainbow load, and there's just so many different angles you can start to leave that hip joint at when you go into hip extension.